For this tutorial, we'll go through the process of creating allograph grayscale images that align with your original color source to create tactile elevated prints. Before proceeding, make sure to at least review the intro video in this series to familiarize yourself with the fundamentals of this process. For this tutorial, we'll take this Warhol-inspired image that was 3D rendered and add elevation. If you have 3D files, they can be used to generate an elevation image. However, we'll proceed as though this is an illustration file created in Photoshop. This 16-bit image is 32 by 48 centimeters at 300 dpi, and will have a maximum elevation of 3 millimeters. If we simply convert the color image to grayscale, and use that to elevate, we get this, a mixed-up series of heights with sharp cutoff walls. Using this as an elevation source doesn't give the cylindrical result we're looking for. If this is the effect you want, you're done. However, more than likely, some editing and new gradients will need to be added. For instance, making the area here the high point. What we're working towards is this low-contrast grayscale image consisting of gradients that define a cylinder like this. Here, we can compare the effects of a simple conversion image next to a custom grayscale image in this point cloud preview. Essentially, what we're producing is a low-relief map for the original 2D color image. However, what it will not become is a 3D image. It has elements that rise up in the third dimension, but as there's no backside to see, and no undercuts, it's more like 2.5D, technically a linear extrusion up off the surface. Open the color working file in Photoshop, and in the color settings, adjust the following. Select North America Prepress 2, RGB set to Adobe 1998, and CMYK set to US Web-Coded Swap V2. With the file open, turn on gamut warning and make any adjustments to the colors at this point, so expectations are set for the physical CMYK color print. It's important to maintain your layers in the working file, at least the elements that will need elevating, as making selections en masse is simple with these layers at the ready. Save the working image as a PSD. Apply an adjustment layer to create a grayscale version, and consider the tones and what they will give you in elevation. Depending on your image, you may be able to use some or all of these tones. In this case, nothing is working for the effect we need. In this example, we have cylindrical cans which we intend to elevate in a cylindrical fashion. Therefore, these gray tones are of no help in driving these smooth arcs. Not even the ridges on the lid of the can are correct in terms of elevation. Key to your success is to stop thinking of the image in terms of what you know is being represented, a 3D can, and think more in terms of a 2D pixel value. Yes, you can see the arch of the can here, as you know it in reality, but this 2D image of a can has light and dark tones due to the lighting effects, and that gives it the illusion of a curved surface. Train yourself to see the elevation effects of gray tones, rather than the 2D color illusion effects. An everyday example would be a coin. You fundamentally know the inherent low-relief surface of a sculpted coin, but a photograph of one, turned grayscale, won't print with the same surface effect. The highlights are pushed down, and areas that should be well above the surroundings are not so. The lower ridge next to the lip is pushed up, and the noise of scratches is making for a messy surface. There is a recognizable elevation in this style of conversion, but things like the coin seeming to sink into the background surface, the shadow being raised up, and the face highlights sinking into the surface ruin the effect. Since there's nothing to benefit from the color image, we'll start from a flat white background. We'll set the layer transparency about here, so as to use it as a reference for positioning the gradients. On a new layer, identify the center of the lower can, and drag out a black to white perceptual gradient that ends at these edges. In order to mask this gradient to just the can, load the color layer selection and create a mask from that on this layer. To blend these edges to the white background, adjust the mask feather settings to 5 pixels. Due to the perspective of the can, it will be necessary to rasterize the gradient and use distort or perspective to fit it into the shape. This can be done as a final step. Now we have an overall curve to the can, but we need to remove the base and upper rim, which need more customized attention. Load or create the bottom area as a selection, and cut that away from the side's mask layer. Do the same for the top rim, and with that cut away, just the side of the can is elevated on this layer, with the gradient. On a new layer, apply a gradient, this time from dark gray to white, so that the highest tone starts below the height of the sides, and recedes to the background white. Load the bottom selection again and make it a mask. The edges of the mask can be softened to smoothly blend down to the white background by setting the feather to 35. That's working well, but this soft blend of the bottom of the can to the background here is too soft, resulting in the flat background getting noticeably curved up. Add a new layer and fill that with white. And simply load that base selection again, invert it, and make it a mask. Paint with a simple brush along this curve and adjust the mask's feather to 6. That gives the bottom a soft edge of 35 pixels all around, but just 6 pixels along the lower edge of the bottom, without creating a wall. For the top rim, it's a similar process. Duplicate the gradient layer for the sides, delete the mask, and load the color layer selection. Make that the mask for the top rim. Adjust the gradient slightly wider, holding Shift to constrict to 90 degrees. Since this is creating a sharp edge, it's necessary to blur the mask by painting it with a soft brush to blend to the background, thus avoiding the creation of a wall. Set the feather to 5. At this point, we need to consider that the center of this rim is at the highest point, and as such is fine with it being black. However, the center of the side here is also black. This should be adjusted to a dark shade of gray to reduce its height in relation to the rim. Making sure not to go lighter than the bottom tone. The top of the can should be the area that blends back to 2D. Apply a gradient, load the color layer selection, make it a mask, with the brush, paint the corners to blend them below the rim. And nest it underneath the rim layer. Set the feather to 5. The final element is this series of ridges on top, which follow the transition from the gradient to the flat background. It's best to use a mask and the feather tool to make tweaking simple. Fill the layer with black. Draw a line at the center of each ridge, and load that as a mask layer. Adjust the feather setting to get a soft dark line that fades out to the tones underneath. Due to the nature of anti-aliasing mask edges, there are some visible gaps in between all the layer edges. It's a simple fix to painting a few underlay pixels on the mask layers to fill in these gaps. For this project, this group can be duplicated and adjusted to work with these other 3 cans. All are elevated to 3 mm and therefore will all peak at black in each location. To see how the effect looks, we can save out the color and grayscale 16-bit TIFFs and generate a point cloud preview with the image to point cloud converter. Load the resulting PLY file into Cloud Compare and consider the results. With the gradients in place, we have an arching blended curve working well. Take into consideration, after adjusting the point size, the solid appearance of these points on the flat background surface versus on this rising diagonal slope. If you can see through to the empty world space, then it's possible the print will have a darkening of the color. Zoom in with the mouse wheel and then adjust the point size by holding Alt and the mouse wheel. Adjust the point size until the flat areas appear solid. The areas here with the dark gaps mean there will be less ink landing on the slope, and therefore some of the dark base color underneath showing through. The larger the gaps, the more likely the color will print darker, but it doesn't need to be completely solid. The way to reduce the size of the gaps around each point is to reduce the contrast in the elevation file, which reduces the slope. Keep in mind that this can make sharp features like the rim edge seem overly rounded. It's just a matter of give and take. The last step is to rasterize the sides gradient, and apply that perspective adjustment to align the gradient's vertical edges to the edges of the can. Store the mask on a new layer. Crop this layer to just the rectangle around the can. Apply the perspective tool to this area. Restore the mask and remove the empty layer. Due to the fidelity of the printed surface, the peak of the Photoshop gradient may show as a slight edge. In this case, it's rather distracting, so it's necessary to rasterize and apply a Gaussian blur to these gradients. Here's the final print with a total elevation of 3 mm at the highest point. Looking at all 4 peaking at the same elevation, it's clear to see how the compact combination of vertical, horizontal, and elevation compares from largest to smallest. Notice that the same elevation over a diminishing square centimeter area appears to have a more pronounced effect even though all 4 are at the same elevation. Keep this in mind when deciding which areas of the image to elevate and how much. With these techniques and your skills in Photoshop, You should have no problem generating a working grayscale file for your project. For further tips and techniques, check out the other videos in this series.